Hey there, it's Tom Jordan. Got a great program today. I'm particularly excited about this with my upcoming guest, and you've probably seen the headlines. We're going to talk about this or the condescending bumper sticker slogans like Detroit versus everybody from politicians like Alyssa Slotkin, who's now running for U.S. Senator in the state of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of that state, the Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, all of them feigning outrage that Donald Trump would come into the city of Detroit and talk about the real needs of Detroit by identifying the real problems of Detroit. Donald Trump was explaining how Joe Biden and Kamala Harris policies have caused businesses to move out of the country and is affecting, again, cities like Detroit because Detroit is the motor city and the big three automakers are being incentivized to move their manufacturing jobs out of Detroit, out of the state of Michigan, and out of the United States to places like Mexico and China, elsewhere. So Donald Trump said he wants to reverse that trend again. And then he said what's happening in Detroit as a result of Kamala Harris will happen to the rest of America if Kamala Harris is elected president. So as a reminder, here's a tiny snippet everyone is complaining about.
The whole country is going to be like, you want to know the truth? It'll be like Detroit. Our whole country will end up being like Detroit if she's your president. You're going to have a mess on your hands. She destroyed San Francisco. She destroyed, along with Newsom, California. And we're not going to let her do that to this country. We're not going to let it happen.
Yeah, there was nothing wrong with what he said there. In fact, it was all true. So politicians and faux journalists are clutching their pearls. They're beside themselves that Donald Trump would attack Detroit in this way, when in fact he was criticizing Kamala Harris and defending Detroit from policies that have been shown to destroy communities like that. And he also mentioned San Francisco, by the way, as an example of the impacts from Kamala Harris policies. So we're going to go get into this with a well-known journalist from Detroit who's worked in the city and now writes for a number of outlets, including the New York Post. James David Dickson joins me in a moment. Before we get to that, just seconds away from right now, more headlines are coming up after that conversation with James David Dickson. And also, just a reminder to chime in. We love to hear from you. So comment. You can ask questions of me. You can even ask questions of James David Dickson in real time. Just go in the comments section, and we'll bring those up. We'll ask James what he thinks about it. We'll get to those in a moment as well. Also, the best way you can help Tom Jordan Live is simply to subscribe and click that notification bell. That helps us a ton, so appreciate it. All right, so the Gretchen Whitmers, the Alyssa Slotkins, the Jocelyn Bensons, the Kamala Harrises used this statement of Donald Trump regarding Detroit as an opportunity to feign offense in order to garner votes. It's as simple as that. They also released these statements that Detroit has, the best real estate market in the country, that essentially Detroit is this city on a hill. And yeah, I mean, the downtown region is coming back. For those of you who have not been to Detroit ever, or maybe not a long time, it is beautiful downtown. But they're pretending in all of that Detroit is, again, the Paris of the Midwest, with tree-lined streets in every neighborhood, friendly milkmen and women dropping off your weekly supply on an incredibly safe, crime-free street, lived on by highly successful individuals and families earning an annual income of $120K a year with these manicured front lawns. That's not really the case. So let me show you some current day neighborhood streets in the city of Detroit. And you don't have to drive very far to see stuff like this. Tree lined? No, depends on your definition of trees, I guess. Yeah, there's some grass out there. There's some foliage, if you want to call it that. But all this anger from someone saying that Detroit is somehow considered by some people a city that has some ruin within. That, to me, Donald Trump's a realist here. So let's identify the issues. I mean, how many abandoned buildings were there, do you think, in Detroit in 2013? The year I moved to Detroit. That was the same year they finally had to declare bankruptcy in order to wipe that slate of decades of corruption clean. How many abandoned buildings? 80,000 abandoned buildings in Detroit. We're talking skyscrapers, commercial structures. There were miles and miles of abandoned shops, restaurants, stores, office buildings, auto plants. People just left, and the city never did anything with the ruin. Instead, bribery was rampant among the Democrat public officials. I say was, but They remained in power with decades of promises that would go unfulfilled, decades of the same rhetoric. And then, against the Democratic Party run mayor's will and against the incoming mayoral candidate's will at the time, the Republican governor at the time said, listen, enough is enough. And they legally forced an emergency manager to take over the corrupt government decisions and turn that city around. And what do you know? It began to work because they had fiscal accountability finally. Suddenly it mattered. Where is this money going that you're taking in? Let's make it easier for investors to pour into the downtown area and turn around that city. And the turnaround was pretty quick down there. It's still underway right now. But to pretend the city is without severe issues, massive amounts of murders and gun violence in what was just described again as the most dangerous city in the country for 2024 and among the most dangerous cities in the world. And to pretend the schools are not among the worst in the nation, with about, 7%, I believe, of students able to read proficiently is truly what's offensive. That's the offensive part of it. So Donald Trump's team, they doubled down on this, and rightfully so, on what he said last week. I'll read this real quick to you, and then I want to get to our guest here. Here's what they said. Detroit has suffered from globalist policies championed by Kamala Harris that have shipped manufacturing overseas. Detroit's population has dropped more than 60% since 1960 and maintains the third highest homicide rate in the nation and a poverty rate for full-time workers 3 times as high as the rest of Michigan. So Trump was just simply saying, hey, let's stop this once and for all, but you can't vote for Kamala Harris if you want that to happen, not only to Detroit, but to the rest of the country. And I think it's a solid warning. Detroit is a harbinger of what's to come for the United States if these same liberal economic policies are allowed to continue. All right, so someone who's written about this, who knows the city of Detroit very well, is James David Dickson, a journalist who works for the New York Post, formerly of the Detroit News, also writes on Enjoyer.com and is host of the Enjoyer podcast. And he's a great guy, and you've probably seen him on X, formerly Twitter, a lot as well. And just follow his stuff. He's got stuff every single day. Hey, James, it's really good to have you on the program. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Tom, thank you for having me.
Yeah, you got it. Anytime. Listen, you wrote this piece on Michigan Enjoyer, and I love how you started your latest piece. I'll read it to you. It says, pop quiz. Answer quickly and honestly. Do you want your community to be more like Detroit or less? What do you think most people's answer would be to that question?
I would say less. I would say less. I mean, and another point I made is that we have 10 million people in our beautiful state. 9.4 million of them live somewhere else than Detroit.
Right.
This is a city that used to have 1.8 million people at one point. So you can't tell me that the city that's lost 1 million people since the 50s is beyond criticism, because when all you preach is this cheerleader narrative of Detroit, what you're stepping over are the people of Detroit who get robbed at bus stops and get robbed at dollar stores by people who don't know that there's not much money to be made doing that because their schools let them down before their education even started. And so you have a city where 95% of 8th graders in Detroit can't read at grade level. So if you didn't see the Lions game, you couldn't read the recap of the Lions game. You had to see it in real time or you'd miss the whole thing. So we have real struggles that affect real people, and to reduce it down to, everybody loves the Tigers and the Lions are doing well this year is actually gross. I thought we were told that Black Lives Matter. That's why black appears in capital B's when you read the Detroit News, but apparently they don't.
Yeah, it's really a shame, and you're right about that whole. Hey, we've got the mayor of Detroit, Mike Duggan, came out with a statement pretending he was infuriated by Donald Trump's statement, saying, "What are you talking about? We had the NFL draft here in the city." Yeah, okay, great. It looks good on the surface, and I was glad the NFL draft came to Detroit. I think that, again,
Absolutely.
downtown is a beautiful spot in Detroit, but you don't have to drive very far to understand the real dilemma that real people who live in this real city of Detroit are facing. And you got Governor Whitmer come out and said this statement, pretending she was appalled that Donald Trump would point out the obvious about Detroit. And she countered Donald Trump saying, Detroit is the epitome of grit, defined by winners willing to get their hands dirty to build it up. And I'm saying, yeah, there is grit. I love Detroit, but there's also grime, which Whitmer pretends isn't real. Why is that? Why don't these Democrats, do you think, want people to realize the grimy side of this gritty city?
Yeah, it's funny because when Whitmer said the thing about grit, I thought it was weird because it was a written statement and she put grit in quotes, like not actual grit, but like referring to grit. And
Yeah.
so I just thought that was strange. And Whitmer, when she talks about our economy and what needs to happen, she's pretty much against the grime. I mean, so when you bring in the World Economic Forum and they're
Mhm.
your partner in advanced manufacturing, as Whitmer did, they believe that it's their job to eliminate dull, dirty, and dangerous jobs in the auto industry. And a lot of those are going to be replaced by robots. And so my grandfather moved up here from Louisiana because Henry Ford was the best thing going back then. Probably what, 30s, 40s, maybe even 20s. Um, that dynamic is gone now. There is no Henry Ford now because even those jobs are going to Kentucky and Tennessee. And so our heritage, the stuff that brought a lot of our ancestors here to the state, is at direct risk. And it's policy choices being made. It's not just sensibilities. It's not just the market moving against Detroit's direction. It's our own government officials who are the problem. The call is coming from inside the house.
Yeah, it is, and it is policy, and my goal is that people understand that policies. Think we don't talk politics. Well, politics and policies have real world impact on individual lives, and that's
Right.
why it's so important to care about these issues. I want to get ask this one question. I want to get to some of our questions from our viewers right now who are very engaged in this conversation. But I want to ask you. So, you mentioned your father, your grandfather came here back in Henry Ford. And from
Absolutely.
Louisiana. Okay,
Right.
so back then, Detroit was just a beautiful, and they did call it the Paris of the Midwest, and it's a stunning architecture, this phenomenal city in the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s, the heyday of Detroit, and the 50s even. And then the 60s, it started to change, and there was this dramatic shift in what was going on in the city. And I don't think, I mean, we don't remember that far back in our, generation. We always look at Detroit as being this kind of city on decline and in ruin. But in your view, in your understanding, what did occur back then, 40, 50 years ago, to lead this city, which was once great, into such disrepair?
There's my mom, she passed away last year at 66, and
Oh,
she used to fight me so hard because she loved Detroit. I love the suburbs. I
yeah.
live in Southfield in her old house, and that's just fine. Oakland County is amazing. But she always believed in Detroit itself and the idea of Detroit and the geography of Detroit and even sometimes the leadership of Detroit. And with the transformation of downtown these last few years, I see glimmers of what she may have seen as a kid. I see glimmers of that city that could be something, could matter, but it's just it's a shame that at a time when more people my age, I'm 40, more people my age are open to Detroit than ever, but you're not really winning those battles or fighting those battles for suburbanites. Detroit's trying to portray itself as a world-class city that needs road diets and bike lanes because someone went to Chicago and they had bike lanes. In fact, the battles you need to win are the person who's buying a home today and they're going to buy it in Livonia or Plymouth or Detroit, and it's a jump ball. How
Yeah.
many people could choose Detroit knowing that I'm going to have to educate my kid here someday? We're going to have to be safe here. I'm going to have to sell this house someday. So there's so many things working against Detroit as an idea and as a city that you really need all hands on deck and moving in the right direction. And so portraying it as everything is rosy when the mayor just had to close down riverfront parks during the fireworks,
Hmm.
it's just insulting.
It is insulting. That's the real offense here. And that's why I know for certain that these politicians who are coming out with these, I call them bumper slogan, statements like the Detroit versus everybody. Yeah, okay, it sounds good, but when you think about it, when I moved here, I mentioned I moved here in 2013. It was prior to bankruptcy, and I told my wife, I came out ahead of her. I said, "This is a great place. I love it here, but I got to tell you, to be honest with you, the city of Detroit is the worst looking city I've seen inside of this country because I mentioned 80,000 abandoned buildings and it was
Right.
complete ruin. And then they declared bankruptcy, I think it was July of 2013. And I thought, in my view, from someone just moving in, this is the best thing that could have ever happened to the city. And all these politicians were so opposed to it. No, we just got to continue what we're doing. And I thought, are you kidding me? Can you not see from the outside what your city it was Detroit versus everybody. Don't come into our
Right.
city and tell us how to run it. Well, thankfully, at the time, Governor Rick Snyder said, no, we're coming into your city and telling you how to run it because people's lives are at stake. And that was the beginning of the turnaround. But as you touch on, there is a long way to go. So when I hear statements like this from Mayor Mike Duggan of Detroit, he comes out and responds to Donald Trump and he points out that Detroit has record low homicide rates. And I thought, the homicide rate in Detroit is among the worst right now in 2024 in the country. I think right now
Right.
it's third, but it's still classified as the most dangerous city in the country and one of the most dangerous in the world. His statement makes it seem, as you described, that we have overcome all of these things, and this is the place to live and to walk safely down your street at 10 o'clock at night with, no worries about your own safety. So what do you think is behind those ridiculous, disingenuous claims from people like Mike Duggan or Governor Gretchen Whitmer? Why are they doing
Right.
this?
Well, they're the people who've been in charge. So it's just like when you asked, the mayor of Springfield, Ohio, he's going to say everything's great. Ask the mayor of, Asheville, North Carolina, they're going to say the flood recovery has been historic. Everyone has a vested interest in presenting the work they've done as being successful. And so that's why we have to look at other factors. So Mike Duggan talked about when he first got elected, when he first came on the scene, he said, judge me by the population of this city. Okay, 690,000 in 2013. After a decade of Duggan, we're at 620,000. It's probably actually closer to 600,000. So what's the Mike Duggan success story, especially as this guy looks past Detroit and now wants the big chair, the governor's office in Lansing?
Yeah.
What's the Detroit success story? What's the Mike Duggan success story? I still am looking at an unsafe city that can't protect or educate its kids. Its kids walk through dangerous streets to go to bad schools. So
Okay, so I
tell me
want to
who I should be congratulating for all this.
right, and so you made a good point in your piece. On enjoyer.com, I believe is a website. And Mike Duggan comes out and you kind of just touch, and you alluded to this just moments ago, but he said, there's mass shootings in Detroit all the time. It's an incredibly dangerous city. That's where the real homicides and gun violence is occurring in these urban Detroit kind of just horrible neighborhoods. So he says his whole approach to this, these mass shootings at that block party, is a reason to push for common sense block party control instead of addressing the systemic issues of crime in Detroit. Is that a deflection, in your view, to the real problem? Why not tackle the real issue?
Well, I think anytime we're blaming inanimate objects, we're being dishonest, right? All problems are human problems. So it can't be the guns. It can't be the welfare. It can't be the block parties. It's always the people. And I think the reason we talk about inanimate objects is because it's easier to talk about those things than to talk about people. Because if you talked about people, Mike Duggan has treated the schools of Detroit like a hot potato. Early in his tenure, people kind of wanted him to put his arms around the schools and take on that problem too. He never wanted to do that. He feels that it's stable with Nikolai Viti, the superintendent. No need to do that. But that's the real problem. Until Detroit schools graduate and educate people who have futures, you can expect to hear about people getting robbed at gunpoint at bus stops. This is what people do who have no hope and no options. These aren't people saving up for tuition at Harvard next semester.
Mm. I sometimes I'll go down, and I've worked in Detroit for many years, and I'll take a excursion around the different neighborhoods because even I will be like, well, I'm hearing all this rhetoric about the neighborhoods and everything's coming back, and I just drive a block or two away from my office and see, oh my goodness, I can't believe people live here. They still do,
Right.
and people walking around like they're zombies, not really sure where they're going, and jaywalking constantly across Woodward Avenue, and it's a mess. And you go deeper into the neighborhoods, it is like I just showed the video earlier. These houses are still there that look like the whole block has been, firebombed. Like this is Ukraine. But it's not. It's Detroit. That's on the comeback. And I think it is on the comeback, but it's, again, decades in the making. So I don't know how you deal with the issue. And I know you mentioned Nikolai Vitti. He's the superintendent of the Detroit schools. And he is kind of painted as this hero who's turning around the schools. But then you look at the 95%, what do you say, the eighth graders not reading at grade level?
Right.
95% of them are not reading at grade level. So what
You have
should,
no
in your view,
future.
they have
You have
no
no future with
future.
that school.
So it's the same thing as 10 years ago or 20 years ago, 30 years ago. There's no future. And they feel like they know that. So I know it's a mountain to climb, but what needs to truly, in your view, as you've lived in the city and outside and out in Southfield and whatnot, but when you look at the city of Detroit, how does one, I mean, my view is just that you got to identify the problem before you can fix a problem. So if they're not identifying it, is there going to be any hope? And that's like the first step, right?
Your mentality has to be Detroit for Detroiters, right? So what can we do? If you are a resident of this city, you should be a VIP. Instead, it's the exact opposite, where you feel like your government is not responsive, they're inefficient. Probably the office of government you have the most contact with might be the police department, which is never a pleasant experience. And so imagine thinking that your neighborhood's not safe, but you get pulled over for speeding. It's just everything about the city eats away at you. The money they demand of you, what little they do for you, and what little you get for your money. So I think a mindset change is the biggest thing. If you view the Detroiter as gold and you make people want to join that family of Detroiters, I think that's your path forward.
Yeah, I don't
You
think
have to
higher
you
tax.
everything has to be
Right.
centered around what can I do to make people want to be Detroiters? Make people want to ditch the suburbs, like Detroit Police Department. They've had some success actually re-recruiting people who left for suburban departments because look, you go out to Taylor, there's no action.
Hmm.
You go to Detroit and you can become a real cop. You can get experience. You can work in a number of different units. So there's a lot Detroit could say for itself. It just doesn't have the mentality. Think about the
Yeah.
NFL draft. They put up that clip art looking Detroit sign, which actually in retrospect was fine if you didn't expect it to be a Hollywood sign, right?
Right.
They put up that sign, and here's the real problem with the sign. It's not how it looked. It's that they didn't do it for you. They didn't do it for me.
Mhm.
They did it because out of town visitors were coming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Until you
it's for
think about
show.
the Detroiter first and foremost,
Mm.
you will not grow.
Yeah, you nailed it. That's exactly it. And that's how they felt even way back, was it 2006 with the Super Bowl? Everything got cleaned up for a
Right.
weekend party. And the citizens are like, okay, let's move all the grime away for the cameras. And then it comes right back on Monday. And that has been their approach. And I kind of look at not a
Right.
whole lot has changed because you still have the same type of people in power within the city of Detroit. And I look at these, suburbanites, which you've written about, like the Gretchen Whitmers and the Alyssa Slotkins and the powerful politicians, and they're putting as if they're part of the fabric of the city of Detroit, and they're really
Right.
upset at Donald Trump, but they don't live here, right? They don't live in the city, do they? I mean, I'm
They
not going to
didn't
dox
choose
them, but I don't think they live in the city of Detroit.
they didn't choose Detroit. They haven't chosen it in any meaningful way. And so when you take that kind of maternalistic approach toward Detroit, keep Detroit's name out of your mouth, you're basically saying all I know about Detroit are maybe I go to Fox Theater, maybe I watch a sports game, maybe I go to a WWE event. But it is not an approach that values actual people in Detroit. You're stepping over the people of Detroit to go cheer for the Tigers. And that's fine, but just know that that's what you're doing. You're not a humanitarian because you spend a few nights a year in
Hmm.
Detroit.
Right. And the city of Detroit does not look like the inside of Comerica Park or Ford Field
It
at
does
all, or
not.
Little Caesars Arena. I want to ask you this because I think the larger point that Donald Trump was making was that companies are leaving Michigan, they're leaving Detroit, and they have been for years and decades
Right.
because of policies. And when the companies leave, that means people leave. They follow them. The money leaves, and it leaves these municipalities in a state of ruin. And Donald Trump's whole point was, listen, we can't keep doing to Detroit what these, Kamala Harris type of policies have been doing. We need to reverse that. And if we don't, if she gets elected, those same policies are very anti-business policies, which ends up being anti-people citizen policies because they're the ones that get hurt the most. We can't allow that to happen. If we do, it's all going to the country's going to look like Detroit, meaning that companies are going to leave the United States and go elsewhere, and that's going to leave a lot of people in poverty. I mean, that was his larger, the way I looked at what he was saying there, aside from that 10-second clip. His argument was he was talking about renegotiating the USMCA and all these different deals to allow citizens to make more money and to live productive and thriving lives. So that, to me, I mean, am I wrong here? That seemed like that was his larger point in the whole speech he was giving to the Detroit Economic Club. That was his point.
Right. And I think another approach could be he's talking about the hazards of a one-party state. So who's run Detroit for the last 60 years? They love taking credit for everything else. Who's run Detroit? Democrats.
Yep.
Democrats, they ran it into the ground. I was on the Pulse last night with Coleman Young Jr.
Mm-hmm.
Detroit City Hall is named after his father.
Yep.
Detroit is not better off for his father.
Yep.
I like Coleman personally, but come on. I mean, you cannot say that this was a net positive. And so Detroit has had terrible leadership for all this time, that a lot of people have gotten rich from Detroit, but not a lot of people have done things to make Detroit better. And so the danger of America becoming Detroit, let's think about this. If Harris gets elected, what is she likely to do? She would take that as affirmation that her policies are approved. So they would reopen the border. They would probably stuff the Supreme Court. And then they would also say, with all these 30 million people we've brought in, the only humane thing to do is give amnesty and make everybody a citizen. From that moment on, America becomes a one-party state, and now we go down the road of Detroit, where basically the UAW or whatever union they're connected to is like an official negotiating partner, even with government contracts. Absolute power corrupts, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so you need two different interests. You need hopefully more than two different interests, but you need at least two. And they're seeing it in Asheville, North Carolina. Those people are as blue gets in Asheville. And here's the problem. And so they're blue. The governor is a Democrat. The president's a Democrat. But what are you going to do? You going to vote for Orange Man bad? Or are you going to take whatever help we give you if we give it to you when we give it to you?
Yeah,
And
it
shut
seems
up,
that
because
that's
we've
the argument
scared
they
you.
have.
Yeah.
Orange Man is bad, and
Yeah.
that's our argument for you to vote for me, but we'll keep the status quo. Nothing's really going to change, but at
That's
least
exactly
it
it.
won't. They seem
I'm just
incredibly
not
desperate.
Donald Trump. That's my only argument if I'm Harris, is I'm not Donald Trump.
That's it. Yeah.
That's it.
But then she characterizes Donald Trump like she did yesterday, and Tim Walz the same thing. That they're now making these claims that Donald Trump is so dangerous, and this is what they are portraying Donald Trump as is what is truly dangerous. But they're saying that Donald Trump is going to use the U.S. military against its own citizens. That's what they're claiming he's been saying. He said nothing of the sort. But it seems to instill that kind of fear. They must be incredibly desperate. There's those claims about Donald Trump that he's going to deport U.S. citizens and lock them up with the U.S. military, or who
Right.
knows, maybe do something worse.
Right.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
absurd what they're getting away with saying. And then there's this issue with Kamala Harris. She knows that African-American men are starting to turn more and more towards Donald Trump because they're not buying this whole, racist argument anymore, because they know, listen, Tim Scott and Donald Trump came into Detroit back in 2018, I think it was, and said, listen, we want to give these economic opportunity zones. to allow you to go out and do what you want to do. We shouldn't be intervening as a government in a negative way. Here's the opportunity for, investment into your communities so you can be the entrepreneurs you are dreaming about becoming, and we'll step out and let you do it as you will. Kamala Harris comes in and says, no, we're not going to do that. Actually, what we're going to do is I, as your president, Kamala Harris, I'm going to take taxpayer money and give it specifically to African-American men as a loan, which will be completely unforgivable. Is that smart policy, do you think?
No, it's an attempt to buy votes, and it's not going to be legal. And so it is premised on the people you're offering it to not knowing that it's unconstitutional and will never happen. That's
Right.
more of a slap in the face than anything they could have said. I mean, think about the Obama remarks. Obama was last speaking to fewer people than Jesus
cares?
had disciples. And somehow that speech gets leaked and it
Yeah.
doesn't go well because so 2008 Obama, hope and change. We need a first black president. Great. Let's overlook the fact that his middle name is Hussein. Now in 2024, we have a lady whose middle name is Devi. And so that speech, when you saw Obama talking to the brothers in Pennsylvania, is Hussein speaking on behalf of Devi and the people in the room. And those were to Harris volunteers. Those were to the most committed partisans you could. So you're literally preaching to the choir because the streets have no love for you. Why are
Yep.
you out talking to people, whoever you could find, whoever you could gather together to do that? Why are you berating volunteers? Because it's the easy thing to do.
Yeah, it's incredibly condescending too. That's my takeaway from it. Yeah, I'm going to tell you how to vote based on the color of your skin, even though our policies really haven't helped. If we want to group you under this label of individual and your
And he
character
says,
based on the color of your skin, then we haven't helped you.
yeah,
But vote for us anyway. I apologize. I want to get to some of these questions from our viewers. Let's bring some up here. Camera, let's throw the first one up on the screen. Dave Moody, I have not had a bad problem in the city. A ton of good people, but the bad ones make me drive out of my way to avoid the city at all costs. How do you react to Dave Moody's comment there? He personally has not had a bad problem in the city. There are good people there, but the bad ones make him avoid it at all costs.
I mean, Dave's kind of saying two things. He's kind of saying it's good, except for the bad people who I haven't encountered, which is like everywhere. I think the problem is you're more likely to encounter them, and certainly in a random setting in Detroit, than if you were to get gas a half mile into any suburb adjoining Detroit. That's the problem.
Right. Yeah. Good response, I think, to that. Let's bring up another one. We have another comment or question. Brooks Gibbs. When I lived in the Detroit area for a few years, I heard something about the white flight. I never heard why that happened and what policies produced such a racial divide. Can you explain? Great question, Brooks. James, what do you think of that?
Well, I think white flight is a narrative that's untrue. If you look at it, black people leave Detroit for the same reasons that white people left Detroit. They typically move to suburbs that are safer and can educate their kids. So it's funny. I don't think we understand how much racism underlies the conversation when we talk about Detroit. So when white people leave because the city's unsafe, it's white flight. But when white people move back to Detroit right now because Corktown's cool and because there's food trucks, it's gentrification.
Yeah.
If you
Yeah.
don't hear in that hatred toward yourself and toward your group of people, you should find that unacceptable. You should find this whole kind of discourse disgusting because, my family, we had to leave Detroit. People leave Detroit for the same reasons. It's because they're not safe and their kids don't get educated. So there's no white flight. There's human flight, typically all for the same reasons.
Yeah, they want to be safe. These are families who live in Detroit, a lot of them, and even the ones who don't have kids or a spouse, they don't want to be killed. And I'm sure if they had the opportunity, they would probably leave as well, unless the city cleans itself up. And this whole racial thing too, you nailed it, because it is true that this, the people that left Detroit who happen to be white, they get blamed for leaving. as if they're the
Right.
cause now of crime because they
Right.
left. I mean, that you're even kind of it's a self-defeating argument in and of itself.
It
But then
is.
coming back is this gentrification argument. And listen, these reporters in this town in Detroit, they know full well the racism that they're not well. If you're a white reporter in Detroit and you go down in these neighborhoods, you know for certain because they tell it to your face, get out of here, whitey. And I've heard that so many times and all these reporters know it. They just cover it up. So there's too much racism in this discussion, and all people are the same in terms of they want a safe place to live. They would like a good job to put food on their tables and to live their life as they see fit. And I don't think there's any racial division on that. I think it's the same for everybody. But we've allowed this narrative to really blame certain other people for our own problems, rather than maybe he truly is to blame for that. And there's a whole another narrative we can go down on that whole topic. But I'm glad that was a good question from Brooks Gibbs, and I appreciate that very much. I I don't know what you know. There's activists out here in Detroit. They're fighting for better political representation, better education in the city of Detroit, crime reduction, public health. But so little is being done. They've been crying about this for decades. Um, what do you think is the solution? I mean, is Donald Trump right in terms of, okay, we need to go a different direction if you want there truly to be a different direction in your community? Or is there something else afoot here?
The purpose of a system is what it does. The purpose of the way Detroit and cities like Detroit are run is to create a permanent underclass of people who are reliable votes. We just saw that I think there's 100,000 voters in Detroit. Something like 40,000 absentee ballots have already come in. Those ballots are obviously harvested. The people didn't just wake up one day and decide, it was really important to vote, and especially before election day. And so you are kept dumb and your kids are held back for a reason. And so Detroit is most prey to this culture of death that we have in Michigan, where a lot of the kids are going to be aborted before they're born. And if you are born, you're going to be sent to schools that are either unsafe or can't educate you, or both, which is, if you grow up without the ability to read, you have no future at that point. And so every institution in Detroit is working against the wellness of Detroiters. This is the problem. This is not something that Donald Trump can fix because he didn't create it. This is a problem all within the local character. We got plenty of people making $80,000 plus working in Detroit City Hall, wearing Stacey Adams, the pink suit, the pink shoes to match. And how many of those people have a real heart for Detroiters and a real service toward Detroiters?
Or even fully understand Detroiters. I don't think a whole lot of
not
them.
many.
You mentioned
We have a
that
lot of
this
people
is
eating Detroit, but not a lot of people feeding into Detroit.
that's so good. That's a great way to put that. And you mentioned this permanent underclass of citizens. What do you mean by that? I mean, how does that happen? And I've heard that argument before. It's to keep people in place, the status quo, so they don't advance. So are you saying that Democratic policies right now are purposely keeping people from advancing in their own lives?
They do. I mean, the fact that you go to bad schools is a bad policy. The fact that they might import a bunch of people who can't even speak English into your kid's school is a bad policy. The fact that your kid was kept out of school for so long during COVID, during the years when they were trying to learn how to read, is a bad policy. And so what they do works against the wellness of human beings. It works. Then in Lansing, now you have lawmakers on the Democrat side saying they want to now regulate homeschools in Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
We have a state where 1 out of every 3 students is chronically absent, public school students. So the students that you're actually responsible for, 1 out of 3 of them are chronically absent from class. And you decide to step over an existing problem with the students you manage to want to regulate homeschools. They don't want to regulate homeschools. They want to kill off homeschools and herd you back into public schools.
That's exactly. So Attorney General of Michigan, if people aren't aware of this, Dana Nessel is her name. She wants to destroy the home schools in the state of Michigan, and she casts them as this group of strange individuals who are somehow molesting their children and
Right.
behind closed doors. So now the government needs to go in behind those closed doors and take the
Right.
kids out of the home to protect them and put them into public schools where we know rapes occur. We know drug abuse is rampant. We know that human sex trafficking is occurring in public schools, and all this nonsense is happening. She completely ignores that and pretends it's happening in the home. So let's break down those walls so that we can peer in and take the kids away from their parents. It is really sick what's happening here, but people are buying into this narrative. It's a horrible policy meant to keep people down and to funnel everybody into a failing school system so that
Right.
from the very, preschool on through, they're completely indoctrinated to pretend or to hope only in the Democratic Party, that the Democratic Party is the hand that will continue to feed you so long as you do what we're asking you to do. And then we'll all
Well,
be on good terms.
it's kind of beautiful because, so every student who leaves homeschool and enrolls, that's $10,000 for the school district. So that
Right.
benefits the government, that benefits the school, that benefits the teachers union,
Huh.
which is going to be able
Yeah.
to hire more members and get more dues and all that stuff. And so then the fact that the schools keep you stupid, well, that benefits the people who are going to tell you in a few years to grab a sign that your country's being taken from you and you need to show up at this place and say what we tell you. It is so clear that your minds are being left blank so
Mhm.
they can be programmed, so these messages can be written onto them like Trump is baby Hitler.
Hmm.
This is why we've been dealing with this hypothetical for what, 60, 80 years now? Would you kill
Yep.
baby Hitler?
Hmm.
Turns out this is the emergency they were saving that for.
Hmm.
So if you
Yeah.
call the man baby Hitler enough, someone's going to take that message and say, yeah, I remember in 6th grade I was asked that question. I would kill baby Hitler. I will kill baby Hitler.
Wow.
This
Yeah.
is
And
what our systems produce. It's sad.
yep, that's exactly it. And that's what Tim Walz and Kamala Harris were essentially saying this week about Donald Trump, because he's going to now use the military against you, and he's going to do
Right.
what Hitler did to the Jews in Nazi Germany. It's a flat out lie, and it's dangerous rhetoric. I could talk to you for hours. James David Dickson, you're one of my favorite writers out there and thinkers out there. You're more than common sense. You are common sense, but you're brilliant. So people should read and pay attention to your podcast is Enjoyer, and the
Yes, sir.
website enjoyer.com. Is that what it is?
Enjoyer.com, and for the podcast, enjoyer.com/podcast.
Yeah, it's such a phenomenal thing you do, and I love your pieces now in the New York Post. I've been following you for years. When you used to work for the Detroit News, which is a paper
Oh,
that
yeah.
it just boggles my mind what's happened to
Inexplicable
the Detroit News.
decline they've suffered. We should talk about that at some point too.
We will, because that is a big issue, and what led to that decline of the Detroit News, the
Yeah.
Detroit Free Press, and really and I know now they're all out of their offices now. I think the end of this year, they're being kicked out. Journalism is dead, unfortunately, but you're still alive, James David Dickson, and always
Absolutely.
appreciate coming on. And people, again, go to his podcast, enjoyer.com, and that'll lead you to the podcast and some of his writings as of late. Thanks so much. Always good to talk to you.
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, appreciate it. Have a good one. God bless you. Amazing
All right,
stuff.
take care.
I mean, this is all so important to talk about. Basically, what all these people are coming out, they are lying to you about what Donald Trump said the other day. He's defending Detroit. He wasn't attacking Detroit, which people say all the time. And he's not only doing that, he's trying to prevent ruin from spreading around this country. And you can go city by city by city and look at the ones in this country, primarily the ones that are struggling the most, the residents in the cities, the citizens within those municipalities. Who is running those cities and those municipalities, and sometimes those states? And then look at the outcomes of that. I mean, do your own homework. I could lead you down this, and you probably know exactly where I stand on this because I've looked into it myself. It's best if you do it on your own so you can find out for yourself. All right, so when someone says, this state, it has a Republican governor which has a high crime rate. Well, no, look at the cities in which the high crime rate exists, not the rural areas where the crime isn't. But in those areas where the crime exists, who is running those cities and what policies have they been implementing to allow that kind of crime to occur, or those bad schools, or the businesses that are fleeing that municipality because of overregulation, because they don't want you to succeed. Take a look, do your own homework on that. All right, I want to get into this, and I'll take more of your comments here as well. 4 years ago, this month, is when I pretty much made up my mind that I am leaving the news industry. 4 years ago, 2020. What happened 4 years ago? In October of 2020, I'd had enough of the lies from an industry I used to love. And it culminated with the infamous Hunter Biden laptop right before an election. You know, of all the collusion and election interference I had seen from the media up until that point, this one was a whopper that they actively kept from citizens and voters, and they worked in tandem with the Joe Biden campaign and the Department of Justice, which was so deeply mired with far-left ideologues, you know, like 10 layers deep, and who hated Donald Trump. And I realized the once trusted journalism industry was gone and had been replaced with a one-party, state-run propaganda machine. And it's been 4 years since the explosive revelations about Hunter Biden's infamous laptop from hell first surfaced, and the fallout continues to reverberate through media and through politics and public trust. There's a person named Emma Jo Morris. That's the journalist who broke the story in 2020. Miranda Devine, also with the New York Post, wrote a lot about this. But Emma Jo was reflecting on how this scandal, you know, it was initially dismissed as Russian disinformation by Joe Biden's campaign. And they're the Joe Biden campaign is the one who gathered all those, 51 intelligence experts to somehow claim, they agreed to lie, that this looks like, Russian disinformation. Well, it exposed a deep collaboration between big tech, legacy media, and these intelligence officials to suppress information that could have influenced the 2020 election. I absolutely know it did. I mean, in my heart of hearts, this last straw was what got Joe Biden in office. So in the weeks leading up to the election, outlets like, Twitter and Facebook, they blocked the New York Post's reporting on the laptop. They blocked it. And the major media networks either ignored it or amplified the false claims that it was a foreign disinformation plot. It was more Donald Trump colluding with Russia. That was false. That's disinformation. So you fast forward to today, and it's clear not only was the laptop real, but it played a crucial role in reshaping public trust in both tech and the news media and in government. So that journalist, she was lamenting that, despite all the evidence that was there has been no accountability for those who misled the American people. Nobody apologized to their readers. Nobody apologized to their listeners. Nobody said, yeah, we got it wrong and we were so sorry. We retract everything during that time. And furthermore, we retract all of our, Pulitzer Prize winning articles we wrote claiming that Donald Trump was a spy for Vladimir Putin and he was a spy for Russia. We're retracting those as well. No one is still even, in terms of that side of the news media, the majority, none of them were saying at the time that, Hillary Clinton is a threat to democracy because she refused to accept the outcome of the 2016 election. No one was calling her a danger to democracy back then and still today in the legacy media outlets, but she and others in Congress at the time were refusing to accept this, that Donald Trump was the legitimate president of the United States. So we have all this censorship going on and all this election interference and the coordinated suppression of that Hunter Biden laptop story by big tech and the legacy media. It was a de facto act of election interference by silencing this legitimate news story. Those platforms skewed the information that was available to voters at the time, making it harder for them to make informed choices. It's not just about, media bias. It's about undermining democracy itself and the whole weaponization of the intelligence agencies. The letter from 51 former intelligence officials labeling the laptop as Russian disinformation. How could it not highlight how deeply politicized the intelligence community has become? That's like Exhibit F on how corrupt these intelligence agencies are. And, these figures, trusted to protect national security, instead use their credentials to push a false narrative that directly benefited their preferred political candidate. And to me, this was the biggest issue, the media culpability in this, the election interference, and now there's no accountability. We're in a media accountability crisis. The fact that major outlets like CBS News, remember that interview Leslie Stahl at 60 Minutes told Donald Trump there's no way to verify that laptop is real. It was already verified, and we all knew it, and I believe she knew it as well. The New York Times quietly confirmed later that the laptop's authenticity was, it was the real deal, but years later, quietly, no apology, no retraction for their initial dismissals regarding it. It's this larger issue that it all underscores. The media is no longer interested in being a check on power, but rather an arm of political advocacy, protecting one party, the Democratic Party, protecting them at the expense of truth. Yeah, so I left that industry because it is thoroughly corrupt, through and through. By the way, Detroit and its home state of Michigan, just so you know, it's so bad for business that the aforementioned big Detroit 3 automakers may be down to 2. We were talking about the big 3 with James David Dickson. The big 3 automakers, Motor City. Well, Stellantis, formerly known as Chrysler, is now trying to get out of where it all started in Detroit, in the Metro Detroit area in the state of Michigan. So Stellantis is grappling with all these layoffs and these strikes and the shifting focus toward electric vehicles by government mandate. And Michigan has these massive regulations under the Democrat-controlled legislature and the governor's office. And by the way, Governor Gretchen Whitmer claims that keeping Stellantis from moving its headquarters out of state is a top priority, but her recent social media antics maybe suggest otherwise. I'm sure you've seen some of this, and the Midwester wrote about this kind of dichotomy between these two realities about this. As Stellantis struggles, Whitmer is busy posting videos online, some of which mock serious issues like abortion. You're seeing this one that's mocking basically the communion practice in Christianity. Michigan already seeing this massive decline in these Fortune 500 companies, but the potential loss of Stellantis would be another blow to the state's economy. And despite these productive conversations, it's still unclear how much effort is really going into keeping this critical company rooted in Michigan. So there's a whole lot of, you can call it economic fragility. Whitmer's focus on social media over economic stability. This is like a very dangerous shift in priorities. Have you ever seen a politician like Gretchen Whitmer, I think, embarrassing herself on these, teenage type of or early 20 kind of apps, pretending that she's a young girl and she's the governor of the state of Michigan? Michigan has lost nearly half of its Fortune 500 companies during her tenure. Did you know that? I'll say that again. Michigan has lost nearly half of its Fortune 500 companies since Governor Whitmer has been in office. And then losing Stellantis on top of all of that would be a huge hit. And there's this lack of seriousness, in my view. Instead of engaging in these hard-nosed negotiations to keep jobs in Michigan, Whitmer's spending time on these trendy slang videos and anti-Catholic jokes, and it raises a whole slew of questions about her commitment to real governance. I mean, that's absurd, what we're watching right there. The governor's office claims to be in dialogue with Stellantis. Okay, hopefully they are. I don't necessarily doubt that they're in dialogue with Stellantis, but the lack of a solid plan to offer competitive incentives to keep them here, I don't know, maybe some missed opportunities. And I start to think, okay, what would Donald Trump do if he was the governor of Michigan? I bet Stellantis wouldn't be leaving this great state. And that was kind of his larger point when he's talking about the city of Detroit, to which Governor Whitmer slammed him for saying such a thing. Maybe she should talk like that more often. Might help the economy. There are some recent polls out there that show that Black and Latino voters are gravitating toward the Republican Party at rates not seen in several generations. Former President Donald Trump is poised to receive the highest percentage of African American votes for a GOP candidate since 1960. Since 1960, his support among Latino voters is on par with the numbers George W. Bush saw in 2004, which were very high back then. And these changes reflect this broader trend as voter coalitions are evolving and the assumption that Minorities will always vote Democrat is being challenged, despite what Barack Obama tells you to do. If you're a black man, Barack Obama says you had to vote for Kamala Harris. Why? I mean, can you point out the true real world impacts that Kamala Harris's type of policies have done for African Americans, let alone the entire country, all men, all women? They hurt everybody. So this idea that minority voters should be defined solely by their race, thankfully, is being rejected. And more people need to stand up against this racism that exists. Instead, there should be more nuanced understanding of voter priorities. And thankfully, that is starting to emerge. And just as these parties have historically shifted with these rural and working class voters moving towards the GOP, we're now witnessing a natural and a necessary realignment among minority voters as well. Identity politics. You can't secure loyalty by constantly referring to identity politics. Policies and values matter more. Get rid of this racist narrative. The media's persistent labeling of the GOP as inherently racist has proven ineffective. Many black and Latino voters are saying, yeah, stop saying that to us. We know what's racist, what isn't. They're talking about traditional values and safety, and all of those things matter more. Good education, those things matter more than your narrative about intersectionality and somehow these threats to democracy. So that's another shift that we've been watching as well. All right. If there's any more comments that are up and ready to go, I'd like to get to those as well, Cameron. Not sure if there are any, but if there are, let's bring them up. And whatever they say, I'll try to respond. No? Okay. Oh, we got one. The engineer. Aurora only had a handful of apartment complexes that have been overrun by Venezuelan gangs. Never believe the media or the politicians. Ask the people that live there. Worked in Detroit since 2001. So the engineer is well informed. He understands what Detroit is like, and he certainly understands what Aurora, Colorado is becoming. It's not fully there yet, but, we've talked about Martha Raddatz on ABC News going against J.D. Vance. When J.D. Vance and Donald Trump claimed that these Venezuelan gangs are taking over the city of Aurora, they said that is not true. That is disinformation. There's only a handful of apartment complexes that have been overtaken by these Venezuelan gangs. How irresponsible. And J.D. Vance is like, are you listening to yourself? Like, that's okay? That only a handful of apartment complexes are overtaken. They're not just going into people's apartments and like stealing a few knickknacks. They're actually taking rent they're overtaking the apartment complexes one by one. The property managers are saying, we can't do anything about this. We can't collect rent because the Venezuelan gangs are doing that on our behalf for their benefit. And you're not concerned about this. It is amazing to me what the media and what I used to think were these great journalists, Martha Raddatz, that she would ask such ridiculous questions and minimize how serious this problem is, not just in Aurora, but it's happening there, it's happening in California. Gangs, illegal immigrant gangs from very violent countries are overtaking these neighborhoods one by one. And you're not going to complain until what? I guess 70%, 80% takeover? Is that when you start to pay attention? Just like it took you like 2.5 years to start paying attention to the border? Martha Raddatz? Anyway, we got another comment here. Let's bring that up. We have Vaughn Westerby. What has happened to Mr. Dickson? Has he changed in the last few years? I don't remember him having these views a few years ago. Very enlightening interview. Yeah, Vaughn, I don't know. This is the James David Dickson I've known and I've read. I think maybe he's just being more outspoken, like I am. Like I haven't changed in my career in terms of my belief system, but the difference is, James David Dickson was working as a journalist, so he kept a lot of his personal opinions to himself, and it didn't reflect in his journalistic work. And I like to think it didn't reflect in mine either. I had my thoughts. Everybody has biases, but as journalists, you're not supposed to reveal those biases. In fact, let them interfere with the story that you're writing or communicating. You're not supposed to do that. And we used to all take that very seriously. I mean, there were ramifications. There was accountability for reporters who would come back with a A staged interview was what they would call it. If you made somebody do something, or you put them in a light that they weren't truly reflecting the way you portrayed them, and that called for accountability measures in newsrooms back in the day. But I'm telling you, since I don't know, the early to mid 2000s, there was this slow shift that became more and more rapid. But it started, I think, late George W. Bush presidency. Barack Obama comes in, and then it was full throttle since then. And then when Donald Trump came in, because they wanted more of Barack Obama's policies, and they wanted Hillary Clinton to win. Well, the mask came off, and these so-called journalists revealed who they really are. Far left radicals, and they were activists. And now they're being taught to be activists in some of these J schools, they call them, journalism programs in these various universities. Engineer, thank you for that. Appreciate it. And Wayne, also, thank you for that comment. Yeah, James David Dickson, you should read his stuff. Appreciate it. One more comment here? If we got one, let's get to it. Yes, Arlene. I was so disappointed with the Detroit City Council's decision to rename the Ben Carson High School. Can you believe that? Ben Carson, a man who was raised in Detroit, and he knew the whole Democratic policy thing. Just because he became a conservative, he is one of the most brilliant men. I've met him. I've talked with Ben Carson. I sat right across he and I, back and forth across the table, having a long discussion about Detroit. We were in Denver, Colorado at the time. This is 2-3 years ago. And being that, we were both from the Michigan and Detroit area, we were talking about it. And he's brilliant. He cares about people. And the fact that they come in because he wasn't a Democrat or a far left progressive radical extremist who was racist, he wasn't racist. And he said that Donald Trump isn't a racist, and he knows him really well. And believe me, Ben Carson is thoroughly against racism. They changed the name from Ben Carson High School to a guy that should be celebrated, a neurosurgeon, brilliant individual who happened to get into politics, and because of his political views, they shut him down. Yeah, I agree with you. And Ben Carson, by the way, I've already said so, but he does not believe racism is the real threat that the Democrats are pointing to in this country. They're, in fact, the ones that are projecting racism, but in a more sneaky way of doing it through ideologies like critical race theory and cultural Marxism. It's tearing this country apart. All right, Arlene, good to talk to you. Thank you again for your comment. And thank you all for your comments as well. And a great conversation today with James David Dickson. Again, you can go check out his website, enjoyer.com. Go to ours as well. We love your support, TomJordanLive.com. And subscribe to our various podcasts on YouTube. Of course, it's free. YouTube, Tom Jordan Live. Go to Facebook, Tom Jordan Live. Go to X, Tom Jordan on there as well. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get us. Make sure you subscribe, and we'll keep delivering content best way we can to serve you. Always appreciate your comments as well. Until next time, God bless you. We'll talk to you later.